Two Apache women found in the cold. The rancher took them in and gave them shelter. It was one of the coldest mornings that winter had brought to the vast plains of New Mexico. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale, weak light over the snow-covered fields. A thick layer of frost clung to the grass, turning every blade into something that sparkled like glass. John Thompson, a middle-aged rancher with years of experience in these harsh lands, was already on his morning ride. He had been tending this ranch for decades, and he knew every hill, every stream, and every bend of the land. But no matter how familiar he was with the terrain, mornings like this always demanded caution. The snow made the trails slippery, and the cold could be dangerous for anyone caught unprepared. As John rode his old brown horse Buster across the frozen fields, he kept his eyes sharp for signs of animals, loose cattle, or anything unusual. The wind was biting, carrying sharp gusts that seemed to cut through even the thick coat he wore. He pulled his scarf tighter around his neck and urged Buster forward. The ranch stretched for miles, and often, during winter, he would find himself completely alone, with nothing but the sound of the wind whistling across the plains. Then, just as he was turning a familiar bend near a frozen stream, something caught his eye. At first, it was just a small movement against the white snow, but as he squinted, he realized it was two figures. They were huddled together, sitting on the snow, their heads bowed. They were almost motionless, as if the cold had taken most of their strength. John's heart skipped a beat. In all his years on the ranch, he had seen many things: wild animals, storms, accidents, but seeing two people stranded in this weather was alarming. He quickly guided Buster closer, keeping his voice low and calm. "Hey there, you folks all right?" he called gently. The figures stirred slightly, lifting their heads just enough for him to see their faces. They were young women, likely Apache, and their eyes showed fear and exhaustion. Their skin was pale from the cold, and their hands and feet were red and raw. John could see frost on the edges of their clothing, which seemed thin for the weather. The women looked at him warily. John knew that strangers could be dangerous, and he also knew that trust could not be demanded. It had to be earned. "It's all right," he said softly, dismounting from Buster. He carried a heavy wool blanket in his saddlebag. Carefully, he approached them and wrapped one of the blankets around their shoulders. One woman flinched at first, but didn't pull away. The other's teeth were chattering so hard that John could hear them from a few feet away. He knelt down beside them, holding out his hands for warmth, though he knew it would barely make a difference in this bitter wind. "Can you stand?" he asked gently. They nodded slowly, though their movements were weak. John knew he couldn't leave them here. The snow was deep, the stream nearby was frozen but dangerous, and they were clearly exhausted from exposure. Carefully, he helped the first woman to her feet, then the second. Each step was painful for them, and John supported them as best as he could. His horse stood quietly nearby, sensing the tension and keeping calm. He led them slowly toward the ranch. It was not far, but in this weather every step counted. The women leaned on him for support, and though they didn't speak much, John could see relief in their eyes. He made sure to talk softly, telling them small things to distract from the cold. "Almost there, just a little further," he said, pointing toward the distant outline of his barn and house. The sight of the warm, familiar building seemed to give the women some energy, and their steps became a little steadier. By the time they reached the ranch, John's face was red from the cold, and he was exhausted from carrying the blankets, helping them, and navigating the snow. But he didn't stop. He opened the front door and stepped inside, motioning for the women to enter. The warmth of the house hit them like a wave. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting light and heat across the wooden floor. The women's eyes widened slightly at the sight. It was the first time in hours or perhaps days, that they felt safe and warm. John guided them to chairs near the fire. He offered them hot water in cups, which they accepted shakily. The warmth of the liquid helped thaw them a little, and the simple comfort of sitting by the fire seemed to ease their tension. John kept talking gently, asking simple questions, not pressing too hard. He wanted them to feel safe, not trapped. He could see that fear and caution were still there, but so was gratitude, buried beneath their exhaustion. As they sipped the water, John noticed their clothing, always kept. It was worn and thin, clearly not enough for the harsh winter. He told them he would find some dry clothes and more blankets. They nodded, grateful but quiet. They didn't speak much English, and John knew that gestures and actions would mean more than words. He went to his closet and brought out spare blankets, thick coats, and warm socks. Slowly, carefully, he helped them change. The women's movements were stiff, and John could see the signs of frostbite on their fingers, but he worked gently, making sure not to hurt them. Once they were warm and covered, John finally stepped back and took a deep breath. The initial crisis was over. They were safe, warm, and no longer in immediate danger. For the first time, he could really look at them, see their features, and wonder about their story. They were young, strong-looking women, but the cold had drained them completely. John knew that survival in these lands depended on not just courage, but also skill and luck. These women had been lucky to be found when they were. For a while, they all sat quietly. The women were still wary, but they were beginning to relax, the tension in their bodies slowly easing. John didn't push them to speak. Instead, he talked about small things: the weather, the animals on the ranch, the snow outside. His calm presence seemed to reassure them. Gradually, they began to respond, answering in soft, broken English, their voices weak but steady. John listened carefully, nodding, making sure they knew they were not in danger. Hours passed, and the women started to regain some strength. John gave them a simple meal, stew with vegetables and bread. At first, they ate cautiously, but hunger overcame their hesitation. They ate slowly, savoring the warmth and the nourishment. John watched them with a mixture of relief and curiosity. He didn't press them for their full story yet, but he knew that eventually they would share how they ended up in the cold. That evening, as the wind howled outside and snow continued to fall, John felt a sense of satisfaction he hadn't experienced in a long time. The ranch had always been his life, but it had never felt as meaningful as it did now. He had given shelter to two people in desperate need, and they had trusted him enough to accept it. That trust, fragile though it was, meant more than words could express. By the time night fell, the women were sitting closer to the fire, wrapped in blankets, their faces relaxed for the first time since John had found them. They began to speak in low voices, perhaps sharing small stories with each other, and John listened quietly. He knew this was only the beginning. Their survival depended on more than just warmth and food. It depended on care, patience, and understanding. He was ready to give them all of that. And so, on that cold winter day in a small house on the edge of a vast snow-covered ranch, a simple act of compassion had turned strangers into people who could begin to trust again. John didn't know yet what stories these women carried, or how long they would stay, but he knew one thing clearly: helping those in need was worth every hardship, every cold gust of wind, and every moment of worry. The warmth of the hearth, the safety of the house, and the care he had given were only the first steps in a journey that would change all of their lives. The morning after the cold night, the ranch house felt almost magical. Sunlight streamed faintly through the frost-covered windows, casting long, warm beams across the wooden floor. Outside, the snow still lay thick and heavy, blanketing the ranch in a quiet, peaceful white. John Thompson moved quietly around the house, preparing breakfast. The fire in the hearth had kept the room warm overnight, and the two women were already awake, sitting on chairs near the fire wrapped in thick blankets. John brought over a simple breakfast of porridge, bread, and warm milk. He placed a small bowl in front of each woman and smiled gently. "Eat slowly, take your time," he said in his calm, steady voice. The women nodded shyly, their movements still stiff from the cold and exhaustion. They had slept better than they had in days, but their muscles ached, and their bodies were still weak. John knew that care and patience were the most important things right now. As they began to eat, John noticed how carefully they handled the food. They were hungry, yet they were cautious, almost as if afraid it might disappear. He didn't take offense. He understood. Hunger could make people cautious, and hardship taught lessons that lasted a lifetime. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat quietly nearby, keeping his eyes on them, offering silent reassurance. The fire crackled, filling the room with comforting warmth, and the sound seemed to make the women relax further. After breakfast, John fetched more blankets, thick coats, and some sturdy socks he kept for his own workers in winter. The women accepted them quietly, one after the other, their faces softening as they began to feel the warmth seep into their cold bodies. John helped them change carefully, making sure they were comfortable but never intruding too much. He wanted them to feel safe, not embarrassed or forced. Their gratitude was clear, expressed not in words but in small nods, faint smiles, and a glimmer of relief in their eyes. Once they were dressed in dry, warm clothes, John decided it was time to start small chores around the ranch. The women had survived harsh conditions outside, and he knew that even light activity would help restore their strength and confidence. He guided them gently to the barn, where the animals waited for food and water. "It's simple work," he said softly. "Just help me with these chores if you like. No pressure." The women nodded, eager to do something useful. They moved carefully at first, unsure of their strength, but with each task they grew steadier. John showed them how to feed the chickens, collect eggs, and check on the cows. The women listened attentively, asking questions when they didn't understand. John admired their determination. Even after everything they had endured, they were willing to learn and to help. It reminded him of the resilience people could show when given care and trust. As they worked, John noticed small moments of hesitation. One woman paused while carrying a basket of eggs, glancing at him with concern. He smiled reassuringly. "It's okay. Take your time. You'll get used to it." Slowly, they began to trust themselves again, and their movements became steadier, more confident. By midday, they were smiling quietly, even laughing softly at small mistakes or slips in the snow. The sound was comforting to John, a sign that warmth and safety were slowly replacing fear and exhaustion. After chores, John invited the women to sit by the fire again while he prepared a proper meal. He brought in vegetables from the cellar, some meat from the larder, and began chopping and cooking over the hearth. The women watched quietly, intrigued by his routine. One of them reached out to help, shyly at first, but John encouraged her gently. Soon they were working side by side, chopping, stirring, and learning the rhythm of cooking over a wood fire. They asked questions about ingredients, and John answered, teaching them small tricks that made the work easier. As the food cooked, John noticed that the women's conversation grew slowly but surely. Their voices were soft, cautious, yet filled with curiosity. They spoke a little about their journey, sharing fragments of their story. They had been traveling with a small group when a storm separated them. They had wandered for days, trying to find shelter, but the cold was relentless. Their words were broken, but their meaning was clear. John listened carefully, never interrupting, showing respect with every nod and gentle word. By the time lunch was ready, the women were able to eat more heartily. The stew John had made was simple but filling, and the warmth of the meal seemed to bring color back to their pale faces. They thanked him quietly, glancing at each other, perhaps surprised by how kind a stranger could be. John smiled inwardly, knowing that kindness often spoke louder than any words could. The trust between them was growing, slowly but unmistakably. In the afternoon, John took the women outside to show them around the ranch. The snow still covered the fields, but the sun had risen higher, reflecting brilliantly off the white blanket that covered the land. He showed them the barns, the fences, the pastures, and the frozen streams. He explained the routines he followed every day, the work needed to keep the ranch running, even in the harshest winter. The women listened attentively, asking questions, observing quietly, and beginning to understand the rhythm of life on the ranch. John noticed moments of awe in their eyes, the way sunlight sparkled on the snow, the quiet strength of the animals in the barn, and the calmness of the land despite the harsh weather. It reminded him of how much beauty existed in simple things. For a moment, he thought about the contrast between their life outside, lost in the cold and danger, and the safety and warmth of this ranch. He felt a deep sense of responsibility, knowing he was providing more than shelter. He was giving them hope, a sense of security, and a chance to regain their strength. As the day progressed, the women began to share more about themselves. They told John about their family and community, their traditions, and the skills they had learned from a young age. Tracking, hunting, and surviving in the wild. John was fascinated. He had lived in these lands for years, but he realized he had much to learn from them. Their knowledge of the land, the plants, the weather, and the animals was impressive, and he listened with respect, absorbing their words. In return, John shared his own knowledge. He taught them about caring for livestock in winter, repairing fences, and storing food for harsh months. He showed them how to prepare simple remedies for minor injuries and colds. The women watched carefully, impressed by his practical skills. Slowly, a sense of partnership began to grow between them. They were no longer just survivors. They were helpers, learners, and participants in life on the ranch. By evening, the house was filled with warmth and the aroma of cooked food. The women had begun to laugh softly at small mistakes made during the day, spilled milk, a dropped tool, or a misstep in the snow. Their laughter was light, genuine, and infectious. John felt a sense of pride and relief. What had started as a rescue had begun to turn into a small community where care, trust, and mutual respect created bonds stronger than fear or exhaustion. As night fell, John lit extra lanterns around the house and barn. He made sure the animals were secure and fed, and then returned inside to sit by the fire with the women. They were wrapped in blankets, now comfortable and relaxed, talking quietly and sharing small stories with each other. John listened patiently, understanding that building trust took time, and that safety was more than just warmth or food. It was patience, respect, and care. The day had been long and filled with activity, but it had also been rewarding. The women had begun to regain strength, trust, and confidence. John had learned about their resilience, their skills, and their wisdom. He realized that this simple act of giving shelter was teaching him lessons too. Lessons about patience, empathy, and the power of kindness. That night, as the wind howled outside and snow continued to drift across the plains, the three of them sat quietly in the warmth of the fire. The women were beginning to relax fully, their bodies no longer trembling from the cold. Their eyes held trust, a faint but growing certainty that they were safe here. John watched them with quiet satisfaction, knowing that this was just the beginning of a journey that would shape all of their lives in ways they could not yet imagine. In the quiet of the ranch, with only the crackling fire and the soft sound of snow against the windows, a bond had begun to form. It was a bond built on compassion, patience, and respect, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, kindness could create warmth stronger than any fire. The women, once lost and alone in the cold, had found not just shelter but hope, and John, in helping them, had discovered a deeper sense of purpose and connection to the land and to the lives he touched. Days passed on the ranch, and a quiet rhythm settled over the household. The snow outside was still thick, but inside the warmth of the fire, life was slowly returning to normal. The two Apache women had begun to regain their strength and confidence. Their movements were steadier, their voices stronger, and their smiles more frequent. John Thompson watched them carefully, sensing that this was the perfect time to deepen the bond of trust that had begun to grow between them. That morning, John suggested they take a short walk outside, not far from the ranch. The sun was shining, and the snow glittered like diamonds in the crisp air. The women hesitated at first, unsure of the footing in the snow, but John offered his hand, steady and reassuring. Slowly they followed him across the frozen pasture, their boots crunching in the thick snow. With each step, their confidence grew. The cold was still sharp, but the movement helped warm their bodies and spirits. As they walked, John encouraged them to observe the land around them. He pointed to tracks in the snow, explaining which animals had passed through recently. One of the women's eyes lit up with recognition, and she pointed to a set of small prints. "Rabbit," she said softly, and John nodded, impressed. She then showed him a track he had almost missed, teaching him to notice subtle differences in the snow. John realized that despite his years on the ranch, there was much to learn from these women. They had grown up in the wilderness, understanding it in ways he had never experienced. The walk became a lesson in observation and trust. John taught them how to read the weather, how to sense changes in wind and snow, and how to anticipate problems with animals in winter. In turn, the women taught him how to identify edible plants, how to move silently through the land, and how to spot signs of predators or danger. Each moment was filled with mutual respect. They were no longer simply receiving care. They were actively participating, sharing knowledge, and building a sense of partnership that strengthened the connection between them. Back at the ranch, John guided the women through more chores, giving them responsibilities that were simple but meaningful. They helped mend fences, carry hay, and tend to the animals. At first, John was cautious, ensuring that nothing was too physically demanding. But the women quickly proved their strength and resilience. Their hands, once raw and cold, now moved with precision and care. Each task they completed filled them with a sense of accomplishment, and John quietly admired their determination. During breaks, they would sit near the fire, sipping warm tea and exchanging stories. The women spoke of their family, their traditions, and the ways they had survived in the wilderness before encountering the harsh snowstorm. John listened intently, fascinated by their courage and resourcefulness. He realized that these stories were not just entertainment. They were lessons in survival, resilience, and the value of community. Even in hardship, the women had remained strong, and now their experience was enriching his life as much as his shelter had enriched theirs. One afternoon, John noticed that the women were watching him closely as he repaired a broken fence. Instead of doing it all himself, he invited them to help. He showed them how to use the tools carefully, how to measure and align the wood, and how to ensure the fence would hold through winter storms. The women listened and watched attentively, then tried it themselves. At first they were unsure, fumbling with the unfamiliar tools, but John encouraged them gently, offering guidance without criticism. Slowly their confidence grew, and they began to perform the work with competence and care. John was impressed. They were quick learners, and their focus reflected a deep respect for both the task and for him. Evenings on the ranch became a time for learning and connection. After the chores were done and the animals were fed, they would sit around the fire, talking quietly, sharing lessons and stories. John would recount experiences from his years as a rancher, explaining the challenges of caring for animals, predicting weather changes, and surviving in the sometimes unforgiving landscape. The women, in turn, shared stories of their childhood, the skills they had learned, and the traditions of their people. These conversations were slow, gentle, and respectful. They spoke in short sentences at first, but over time their English improved, and John's understanding of their language and culture deepened. One day, John decided to teach them how to make simple tools and useful items for the ranch. He showed them how to repair harnesses, mend boots, and create small wooden items that could be used around the house. The women were curious and eager to learn. They asked questions, observed carefully, and tried the techniques themselves. At first, their attempts were imperfect, but John encouraged them, praising their effort and persistence. Gradually, their skills improved and they began to take pride in what they could create. Their confidence, once fragile, now grew steadily, nurtured by care, guidance, and trust. The bond between them deepened further when John shared meals with the women. He taught them simple recipes, showing how to prepare hearty stews, breads, and roasted vegetables that could sustain them through winter. The women, in turn, shared traditional dishes from their heritage. They taught him how to prepare certain roots and herbs, explaining their uses and benefits. These exchanges were more than just cooking lessons. They were cultural bridges, allowing each of them to appreciate the life experiences and knowledge of the other. Meals became a time of laughter, learning, and mutual respect. Over time, the women's personalities began to shine through. One was quiet and thoughtful, observing the land and animals with keen attention. The other was lively and curious, asking questions, experimenting with tasks, and often making John laugh with her playful humor. Together, they brought balance to the ranch. John found himself inspired by their presence, appreciating the energy and wisdom they brought into his home. What had begun as an act of simple charity had transformed into a deep and meaningful connection, one that enriched all their lives. Winter storms continued to blow outside, but inside, the warmth of the house and the trust they had built created a safe haven. The women, once strangers, were now valued members of the household, contributing to its work and spirit. John marveled at how much resilience and strength they possessed, and how much he had learned from them in such a short time. He realized that helping someone in need was not just about giving. It was about sharing, learning, and growing together. By the end of the week, it was clear that the women were no longer simply recovering. They were thriving. Their steps were steady, their hands sure, and their voices confident. They laughed more freely and participated actively in the life of the ranch. John watched with quiet satisfaction, knowing that the act of offering shelter and care had blossomed into a lasting connection. They had all become teachers and students at the same time, learning from each other, growing together, and forming a bond that could withstand the harshest of winters. One evening, as the sun set behind the snow-covered hills, casting a golden glow across the ranch, John sat by the fire with the women. They were wrapped in thick blankets, sipping tea and sharing quiet stories. The trust between them was now unmistakable. They had faced fear, hunger, and the cold together, and they had emerged stronger, connected by mutual respect and kindness. John reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. What had begun as a simple act of rescue had transformed into a relationship built on understanding, patience, and shared experiences. He realized that survival was not just about shelter and food. It was about connection, trust, and learning from each other. These women who had once been lost and vulnerable were now empowered, respected, and valued. And in helping them, John had also been enriched, learning lessons of resilience, empathy, and the quiet power of human kindness. As night fell and the fire crackled softly, the three of them sat together in silence, content in each other's company. The snowstorm outside continued its gentle descent, but inside there was warmth, security, and a sense of shared purpose. They had all grown through the experience. John, the rancher who had offered shelter, and the two Apache women who had found safety, trust, and a place to regain their strength. In that quiet winter evening on a small ranch in New Mexico, the bond they had formed felt unbreakable. It was built not on words alone, but on actions, respect, patience, and care. They had learned from each other, supported each other, and in doing so, created something far more lasting than temporary shelter. They had created trust, understanding, and friendship, a connection that would remain long after the snow had melted and winter had passed. The days on the ranch began to feel almost like a new rhythm of life. Winter had begun to soften, the snow slowly melting in some areas while still lingering in patches that sparkled under the weak winter sun. The two Apache women had fully recovered from their ordeal in the cold. Their faces, once pale from the frost, now glowed with health, and their movements were strong and confident. They had become an integral part of the ranch's daily life, helping John with chores, tending to the animals, and sharing knowledge that enriched the ranch in countless ways. John noticed how much they had grown over the past weeks. At first, they had been cautious, quiet, almost afraid of the harsh environment and the unfamiliar ranch. Now, they moved with purpose, their eyes bright with curiosity and energy. They laughed freely, asking questions, and even suggesting small improvements to tasks around the ranch. John smiled often at their enthusiasm. It was rewarding to see how resilience and care could transform fear into confidence and strength. One morning, John suggested they take a walk toward the edge of the property, where the forest met the open fields. The women agreed, excited to explore the area they had previously avoided. As they walked, John encouraged them to observe everything: the patterns of the trees, the tracks of animals, and the changes in the land from the melting snow. They pointed out things he had missed, small signs of life in the forest that spoke of hidden streams, birds, and small mammals. John was impressed and grateful for the lessons they continued to share. During the walk, the women spoke more openly about their lives and community. They explained the traditions of their people, the respect for nature, and the ways they had learned to survive in the wilderness. John listened intently, absorbing every detail. He realized that their knowledge was a gift, not just about survival, but about understanding the world in a deeper, more connected way. In turn, he shared his knowledge of ranch life, explaining how he managed the land, cared for the animals, and prepared for winter storms. Their exchanges were slow but meaningful, each teaching the other lessons that could not be learned from books. Back at the ranch, John decided to involve the women in preparing for the approaching spring. He showed them how to plan for planting gardens, how to repair equipment damaged by winter, and how to organize supplies. The women listened carefully, asking questions, and even suggesting methods they had used in their own community. John realized that their experience was invaluable. Together, they developed small plans that made life on the ranch more efficient and harmonious. It was no longer just about survival. They were shaping the ranch's future together. Meals continued to be a shared joy. The women had grown skilled at helping John in the kitchen, and they had introduced new flavors and methods inspired by their own heritage. Cooking together became a form of connection, a way to share stories, laughter, and culture. John enjoyed seeing how much the women had come to enjoy life on the ranch, and they, in turn, seemed to appreciate his patience, guidance, and unwavering care. The bond between them had grown beyond gratitude. It had become a genuine friendship. One afternoon, John noticed the women preparing small crafts from wood and leather scraps around the barn. They had learned quickly how to use the tools safely and creatively, making items that were both practical and decorative. John admired their skill and focus. He realized that survival skills were only one part of their knowledge. Creativity, patience, and attention to detail were equally important. He encouraged them to continue, praising their efforts and marveling at what they could create. Their eyes shone with pride and accomplishment, a reflection of the confidence they had gained since arriving at the ranch. As the week progressed, John understood that it was time to discuss the inevitable, the women's return to their community. They had regained strength, confidence, and warmth. They were no longer in danger, and their families would be searching for them. He approached the subject carefully, knowing it could be emotional. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, he spoke gently. "Soon, it will be time for you to return home. I want you to be ready, strong, and safe when that happens." The women listened quietly. They had grown attached to the safety and routine of the ranch, and the thought of leaving was bittersweet. Yet they also knew that their community and family awaited them. John reassured them that they would always be welcome at the ranch, and that he would help guide them safely back to their people. This reassurance brought smiles to their faces, and though quiet, their eyes reflected gratitude, trust, and a sense of closure for this chapter of their journey. In the following days, preparations for their departure began. John helped the women pack their belongings, choosing items that would be useful for their journey. Blankets, food supplies, and small crafted items they had made during their stay were included. The women carefully selected personal items as well, sentimental tokens of their time at the ranch. The process was slow and filled with care, reflecting the deep bond that had developed over weeks of shared experience, trust, and mutual respect. The day of departure arrived with a clear, crisp morning. The sky was pale blue, and the snow still lingered in patches, sparkling in the sunlight. The women were dressed warmly, carrying the supplies John had prepared. They stood at the edge of the ranch, looking back at the house, the barn, and the fields that had become their temporary home. John stood with them, offering quiet words of encouragement. "Be safe. Trust your strength and knowledge. Your families will be waiting," he said gently. Before leaving, the women turned to John, giving him small gifts they had made during their stay. One crafted a simple leather pouch, the other a wooden ornament, both carefully made with skill and care. They expressed their gratitude not just through words, but through these tangible symbols of respect and connection. John accepted them humbly, touched by the thoughtfulness and effort behind each item. The gifts were reminders of the bond they had formed and the lessons they had shared. As they began their journey back to their community, John watched them walk across the snow-covered plains, their steps steady and confident. He felt a mixture of pride, relief, and admiration. These women, once lost and vulnerable in the harsh cold, had grown stronger, wiser, and more self-assured. They had survived, thrived, and carried with them a sense of independence and hope. John realized that offering shelter and care had done more than save lives. It had fostered growth, learning, and mutual respect. In the weeks that followed, John continued his work on the ranch, often thinking of the women and the time they had shared. Their presence had left a lasting impact on him. He had learned lessons in patience, resilience, empathy, and the value of sharing knowledge. The experience had reminded him of the power of kindness, and how a single act of compassion could ripple outward, creating connections that endure far beyond the moment. The women returned to their community safely, sharing stories of their time at the ranch and the care they had received from John. Their families were relieved and grateful, and the women themselves carried a newfound confidence and strength. They had survived the harsh winter, but more importantly, they had experienced trust, safety, and the warmth of human connection. John, in turn, continued his life on the ranch with a renewed sense of purpose. He remembered their laughter, their questions, and the moments of shared learning. Though they were no longer present, the lessons they had shared, the knowledge they had imparted, and the bond they had formed remained in his heart. He knew that the kindness he had offered had not only saved them, but had also enriched his own life in ways he would carry forever. As the seasons changed and the snow melted, the ranch remained much the same in its routines. But John's perspective had shifted. He understood that life was not just about work, survival, or routine. It was about the connections we make, the care we offer, and the trust we build. The memory of the two Apache women, once found lost and cold in the harsh winter, became a lasting reminder that even in the toughest circumstances, compassion, patience, and understanding could create warmth stronger than any fire. Years later, John would recall that winter not just as a time of cold and hardship, but as a season of growth, learning, and connection. The two women had arrived as strangers, seeking only warmth and safety, and they had left leaving a legacy of friendship, mutual respect, and shared knowledge. Their story, though brief in time, had become a lasting chapter in the life of the ranch, reminding John that sometimes the simplest acts, offering shelter, food, and kindness, could have the deepest, most enduring impact. In the quiet of the ranch, with the sun setting behind the distant hills, John would often sit by the fire and reflect on that winter. He remembered the laughter, the shared lessons, and the moments of trust that had formed when life seemed most fragile. He realized that the bonds created in hardship often lasted the longest, stronger than fear, stronger than cold, and richer than the passing of time. The two Apache women, once found lost and vulnerable, had not only survived, they had transformed the ranch and his understanding of human connection forever.